in one of my last acts as PARR president to convene our monthly meeting in lieu of our convention that we should have been having in Palm Springs about 2 weeks ago. And as I was speaking with my wife Lori this morning, and I said, today's the day I get relieved of my year. She said, well, it's really more than a year. You're probably the longest serving PARR president. So perhaps I'm the longest serving PARR president in what has felt like the longest year ever. Thankfully, we are beyond that now, and we've had the true transition of power yesterday. We're going to have another transition of power afterwards, after our guest speaker today, but we're really pleased to have so many of you on board today to study with us, and then hopefully, if you're able to stay for a few minutes extra while we have our acknowledgement of past officers and members of the PARR board and installation of Suzanne and the new board. So I would like to invite our Vice President, Suzanne Singer, to lead the introduction of our special guest teacher for this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Evan. I'm going to ask people to please mute themselves so that we don't have extraneous noises. And I am really honored to be able to introduce Dr. Alyssa Gray, who is the Emily S. and Rabbi Bernard H. Melman Chair in Rabbinics and Professor of Codes and Responsa Literature at HUC-JIR in New York. She has an incredibly distinguished history of academics. She received her PhD with distinction in Talmud and Rabbinics from the Jewish Theological Seminary, and also earned an LLM in Mishpat Ivri. Larry, do you know what that means? It means Jewish law, from the Hebrew University Faculty of Law. She's a graduate of Barnard College, magna cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, and the Jewish Theological Seminary, and earned a JD from the Columbia University School of Law, where she was a Harlan Fiske Stone Scholar. Dr. Gray researches and writes on the development of Talmudic literature and the history of Jewish law. She's the author most recently of Charity in Rabbinic Judaism, Atonement, Rewards, and Righteousness, and of A Talmud in Exile, the influence of Yerushalmi Avodah Zarah on the formation of Bavli Avodah Zarah. She's also published numerous shorter studies on topics such as Jewish liturgy, wealth, poverty, and charity in Jewish law and tradition, and Talmudic redaction and the application of legal and literary theory to the study of medieval Jewish legal works. She's been a visiting professor at Yale University and the Jewish Theological Seminary. She's also lectured in a variety of other academic and non-academic settings, including Hebrew University, Bar Ilan University, Colby College, the University of Chicago, the University of Illinois at Chicago, Florida Atlantic University, the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the Freehoff Institute for Progressive Halacha, Limud UK, the World Union for Progressive Judaism, the Masorti Movement in Latin America, and the Union for Reform Judaism, and now PARR. Dr. Gray is co-editor of AJS Review, the Journal of the Association for Jewish Studies, and she also sits on the editorial boards of the Journal of Jewish Ethics and of HUC Press. So we are so honored to have you this morning, or this afternoon rather. Alyssa, Dr. Gray, and please take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Suzanne. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your warm, lengthy introduction. If I had known you were going to give the full introduction, I would have given my dear mother the Zoom link, at least for this few seconds. I noticed Rabbi Larry Goldmark. I just, the site, hi Larry, made me smile. Larry, I don't know if you remember, maybe you do. The last time I came to PARR, which was many years ago, I think it was 2009, I checked. You good-naturedly ribbed me the entire time because I did not have translations with the texts. You were very funny. You kept ribbing me in various amusing ways the entire time. So you'll be pleased to see, Larry, that most of today's texts thanks to our good friends at Safaria. Most of today's texts do have translations, but I was reminded of that and of the wonderful time I had at PARR many years ago by seeing Larry. So again, it's very nice. It's very nice to be back. We are still in the midst of this pestilence, even though perhaps now the light has appeared at the end of the tunnel, or whatever metaphor one would like to use. And I do find it interesting and comforting and just altogether uplifting and enriching to look into our tradition. And what I want to study with you today, I know it seems like we have a lot of time. In fact, it isn't necessarily that much time, is to take as our base text an excerpt of this responsum of the Maharil, Rabbi Jacob Moline, as you can see here, known by his acronym, the Maharil, Mainz and Worms. He's in sort of shortly after the Black Death period, 1365 to 1427. This is from his collection of responsa. According to the version on the Bar Ilan Responsa Project, it's number 41. In fact, for those of us who are interested in such things in manuscript, it's number 50, whatever. But it's a responsum that he writes about the topic of plague. I'll get more specific in a moment. And I've excerpted it. I haven't excerpted out any of the good parts, except maybe for the second part, which is sort of about a breach of contract claim that arose out of a claim, out of a time of plague. But we're focusing on a very specific issue that he's asked, which is the issue of, is it permitted or is it not permitted to flee from a plague area? Is it permitted to flee? So the plague is coming to your area. Can you leave? Can you go? Is it forbidden or permitted to flee from the plague area? And what I find very interesting is we're going to get an answer. It's not that we're not going to get an answer. We're going to get an answer. But what's interesting is how deeply intertwined and inextricable the answer is from theology. The answer is bound up in texts from the Talmud Bavli that are theological in nature. Now, we could take one of two approaches to this entire subject. We could either look at it strictly historically, or we could look at it theologically and hermeneutically. I'm going to look at it theologically and hermeneutically, even though there is an interesting historical context there in terms of non-Jews and their approaches towards staying in a plague area versus fleeing. But we're going to look at it again theologically and hermeneutically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start. You can see here I've excerpted, I have two paragraphs from the responsum of the Maharil. I'm going to take us through the first one, then you have my ellipsis there. Then at that point, I understand that you may want some sort of chavruta period. I will send you out with a very, very short leash to approach a very particular question in relation to a very particular text, and then we will reconvene and tackle the part of the responsum that I have under the ellipsis, and then eventually we will deal as well a little bit with a later 16th century scholar. So without further ado, Rabbi Jacob Moline. So here, Larry, I have to disappoint you, or maybe confirm your previous suspicions. I don't have translation here for this, but it's enough. I think we'll get through this, and then we'll get to the Talmudic text. So here he's responding, Moline is, to the person who wrote to him. And the person who wrote to him is asking about if it's permitted to flee from a place of plague. And the person, the questioner, has his sense of it is that in fact it is forbidden. So Moline responds to him. We don't get the actual language of the question that was asked in the way it was asked, which is typical actually of the way that we get these things reproduced in responsa, but we get the sense of what he's asking from what Moline writes. He says, Ma de katav mar, that which the master wrote, dinire shehu isura livroach v'chule, that it appears that it is a prohibition, it is an isura, It is an isur. It is forbidden. It is a prohibition to flee. And then you'll notice in bold, number 1, this is how I'm marking out the Talmudic sources. He says, Perek Ze Borer. This was a source that was cited by Molin's questioner. In Perek Ze Borer, in the chapter this one chooses, Amrinan, we say, Shev Shnei Hava Motana, 7 years was the pestilence, the Motana, like Mavet, the plague, the death event. 7 years was the plague, the Inish Bala Zimne La Shchiv, and a person does not die ahead of their time. Now here, I'll avoid the urge to go all classroom on you as to why the Talmudic source, to ask you why the Talmudic source is introduced by this name, Perek Ze Borer. And the answer, of course, is Molin is living right before the beginning of the era of printing. Molin doesn't know the Talmudic text with A and B and numbered pages the way we have it. And before printing, that was how people referred to Talmudic texts. You told people, go to the chapter, and you would give the first couple of words of the first Mishnah of that chapter. And the optimistic assumption was that the person you were dealing with would be able to locate the text in that chapter. So Perek Ze Borer, thank heaven, we don't have to do that. We know it's Sanhedrin 29a. Number 1, I've reproduced the text here below. Talmud Bavli, Masechet Sanhedrin 29a, Shev Shnei Hava Motana, 7 years there was a pestilence. I lifted the translation here as I credit Safaria. 7 years there was a pestilence. The Inish Bala Shnei La Shchiv. But a man who has not reached his years did not die. And then, of course, the translation includes the little editorial note. In other words, everyone dies at his predestined time. So what was the questioner doing? The questioner who's asking Molin, is it permitted or forbidden? Is it permitted or forbidden to flee from a plague zone? The person was tipping his own hand that he thought it was forbidden, because the Talmud says there was 7 years of a plague, and nobody dies before their time. In other words, people die at the time they're supposed to die. Whether or not there's a plague doesn't matter. If there's a terrible plague, all the people that die during the plague then presumably are supposed to die during that period anyway. Therefore, as Molin paraphrases the questioner's assumption, mashma k'tzat, here you can see I'm back in the second line of the responsum, mashma k'tzat, it may be inferred in part de'ein livroach, that one must not flee. That's right. In other words, if there's no connection between the plague and when it is that a given person is supposed to die, that God has arranged the world such that people are going to die when they're supposed to die, regardless of what's going on in the world, then there's no reason to flee. It's forbidden to flee. Don't flee. One then doesn't flee. But Molin challenges this. Molin challenges this. And this is where it begins to get very interesting to notice the intertwining of these different and contradictory theological threads in the Talmud Bavli. Molin says, in effect, that's not the only source out there. He says, Omnam nireh, indeed we see, de'eno ela mashal ba'alma da'amre inshe. First, he casts a little shade on Sanhedrin 29a. He says, it appears that this is basically just a homey parable, a mashal ba'alma. It's simply, it's one of these homey sayings, da'amre inshe, that people say. In other words, it may be that statement of the Talmud that people die when they're supposed to die, 7 years of plague and nobody died before their time. Maybe that shouldn't be taken too seriously, really, as a statement of the way God works in the world. It's a thing people say. Instead, Molin moves toward another source, which is very rich, very disturbing, and very interesting. Number 2, we'll jump down in a minute, de Parakama de Chagiga. In the first chapter of Chagiga, the first chapter of Tractate Chagiga, Amrinan, we say, Diyesh nispeh below mishpat, This is a quote from Proverbs 13:23. There is one who is gathered in, a euphemism for dying. There is one who dies unjustly. Ki hod amar le l'shluchei. Okay, at this point, we'll jump down to the source itself because Moline gives us a lead in. This source is very interesting. And as I said, it's very rich and very troubling. And it certainly is in tension with the easy, facile optimism of Sanhedrin 29a. Here we have Chagiga 4b to 5a. It's part of an extended Agadic sequence in the beginning of Tractate Chagiga. And it begins this way. Rav Yosef kimate lahai kra bache. Rav Yosef, when he reached this particular verse, he wept. And this is actually part of a lengthy sequence in which we're told that rabbis would be moved to tears by particular verses. And here was the verse that would cause Rav Yosef to weep, V'yesh nispeh below mishpat. There are those who are swept away without justice, Proverbs 13:23. Amar, he said, Mi'ika da'azel below zimne? Is there really a person who goes before his time? In other words, somebody who dies unjustly before their time. And the Gemara comes right back in. Yes, here's the story. Ki hod Rav Bevai bar Abaye hava shechiach gabe malach hamavet. Rav Bevai bar Abaye, kept some interesting company. He used to sort of hang out with the angel of death, the malach hamavet. Amar le l'shluchei, and the angel of death said to his agent, his shaliach. So the angel of death has, a corporate structure here. He says to his agent, Zil aiti li Miriam Magdala Seyar Nashaya. So the angel of death said to his own agent, go bring me Miriam the hairdresser. Miriam, the one who, sort of poofs out, Magadla, who sort of grows the hair of women, Miriam the hairdresser. You can't get good help anywhere. So Azal Aitile Miriam Magadla Dardaki. So instead, the agent goes out and brings in Miriam, the early childhood director. That's what he brings back. Miriam Magadla Dardaki. Miriam, the one who raises small children. In other words, he brought back the wrong person. He was supposed to get, the person who was supposed to die was Miriam, the hairdresser. He brings back Miriam, the early childhood director. Amarle, so the angel of death said to him, I'm now on this next page, Anna Miriam Magadla Seyar Nishaya Amrilach. I told you to bring me Miriam, the hairdresser. So the agent presumably is now befuddled, Amarle. So he says back to the angel of death, Ihachi Ahadra. If so, I'll bring her back. I'll bring back Miriam, the hairdresser. I'll restore her to life. And I guess I'll, get the other one, I guess. Amarle, but the angel of death says to him, well, no, Hoil ba'ayatita lehava leminyana. Since you've already brought her, let her literally join the minyan. Let her join sort of the count of the deceased. In other words, I guess too bad, so sad for Miriam the hairdresser. She died before her time. In the language of Proverbs 13:23, she's kind of nispeh below mishpat, but that's the way it is. Then comes the question. The question is, Rav Bevai bar Abaye is puzzled. How could this happen? How could it be that this could come about, that the angel of death tells the agent to bring X and the angel of death brings Y, and that seems to be okay? So he asks, Elahechi yachokwa, literally, how were you able to get her? How were you able to do that? What made poor Miriam, the early childhood director, vulnerable that you were able to bring her before her time? And then he tells, the agent tells a little story, which is revealing about the some of what's going on behind, under the hood, as it were, of the rabbinic theological process here. Havat Nikita mita'ara biyada. Basically, she was engaged in a dangerous activity. She was vulnerable. She was holding a shovel in her hand. Vahavat koshagra umacharia tanura. And she was sweeping out a hot oven. Shakalta v'anchata agaba tekara. She sort of swept out, presumably some of the hot coals, whatever was producing heat in the oven, rested it on her foot. Kadcha, she got burned. V'itara mazala, and her luck went down. She was vulnerable at that moment. Va'ayatita, and I brought her. In other words, Miriam, poor Miriam, the early childhood director, happened to be doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. She happened to be engaged in a dangerous activity, sweeping out the hot oven at the time when the agent of the angel of death was in the neighborhood. It doesn't take too much imagination to think about the larger connection, even though Moline, the author of our responsum, isn't bringing it all together yet, that in a time of plague, one is vulnerable. In a time of plague, one is living in a context which is broadly analogous to Miriam, the childhood director, sweeping out the hot oven. And again, in a time of plague, one can imagine that the angel of death or the angel of death's minions are running about, and one is vulnerable at the wrong time. So this is, even though one likes to think, and Sanhedrin 29a invites consideration of an orderly world in which God sets the limits on life for everyone and nobody's going to die before their time, Chagiga here, 4b to 5a, in this sad story, raises the possibility, which is more than a possibility. It's something that people see as part of life, that people seem to die before their time, that unjust things happen, that some go when they shouldn't go. And you know what? Sometimes bad things happen. The person was vulnerable. They were in a vulnerable state at the wrong time, and something happened. But of course, the rabbi, and you all know this better than me, they're not going to let it go. So Amarle Rabbevai Barabaye. So Rabbevai Barabaye, he's not going to take this story lying down. He says, It lacho reshuta lame'avad hachi? Do you, and lahu is in the plural. In other words, do you, the agent, and you, the angel of death, do you really have permission to do this? Do you really have the right to behave in this way? How can you do this? So the angel of death answers him, Amarle, Velaktiv v'yesh nispeh below mishpat. The angel of death answers him, well, but isn't it written in Proverbs 13:23? There is one who is swept away without justice. In other words, the angel of death says, why are you asking me? It's written right there in scripture. Proverbs 13:23 says it flat out, that this is a possibility. And then again, this is why one has to love the Talmud Bavli. The rabbi's not letting it go. Amarle, again, Rabbevai Barabaye says back to him, okay, look, you want to play this game of you cite a verse. I could cite a verse too. V'hoktiv, isn't it written, dor halach, dor holech, v'dor ba? Isn't it written in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 4, one generation passes away and another generation comes? In other words, there's a generation and presumably a fixed number of people in that generation and a fixed amount of time that generation, the people of that generation are supposed to live. So how can you be running around snatching people by mistake before their time and just then sort of, washing your hands of it and saying that's the way it is? And then he has an answer for that too. Amar, he says, and this, by the way, is already getting a little beyond where we need to go, but why not just ride this train to the end? He says, Darina laho ana adamalu lahu ladara. He says, I take these people who were snatched up by my agent by accident. I take them and I hold on to them. I hold on to them until their generation is completed. So, whatever generation you want to talk about, the silent generation, this, that, or the other, I hold it until everybody from that generation is done. V'hadar mashlimna le'leduma. And then when that entire generation is done, I take the souls of those people together with people who may have been gathered up by accident, and I give them to Duma, who presumably presides over the dead. Amar le sof sof shnei mai avadit. Okay, basically what happens to the extra years that that person should have had. And then here's the answer, which I suppose is supposed to make the rabbis happy. Amar i'ika tzorba me rabbanan ma'avir b'mile mosifna lahule. If there is a rabbi who is very humble, who overlooks insults to him, I add those years to him, v'havya chilufe. And that person becomes sort of the substitute for the person who died. Okay, whether we like it or not as a global matter is another thing. I just want to point out how Moline is using this. And don't worry, we'll get back to that in a second, which is the questioner brought up Sanhedrin 29a. It should be forbidden to flee a place of plague because Sanhedrin 29a says whoever dies, dies in their proper time. Moline says, first of all, Sanhedrin 29a may just be a homely saying that we're not supposed to read too much into. And secondly, look at this story from Chagiga. And the conclusion that Moline draws here in these three Aramaic words is Alma de ta'e shluche. Consequently, what do we see? That agents, shluche, agents of the angel of death, ta'e, they err. In other words, Chagiga 4b to 5a complicates and undermines Sanhedrin 29a. It complicates it and undermines it. People do die for no reason. People do die before their time. Stupid things happen because people tragically are vulnerable. They're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Therefore, Moline's introduction of this text is a way to say, consequently, it's not so simple to tell people that they're forbidden to flee a plague zone. Maybe they should be permitted to flee a plague zone because who knows what can happen. Once this gets unleashed upon the world, everybody may get caught up in it, whether it's technically, quote unquote, their time or whether it is not their time. And then he folds a third source into it. He says, Kol shekain kahai gavna. All the more so is that true in this kind of a case, this plague kind of a case. It yahev le reshuta, when permission is given, and here you'll notice I have number 3, and I'll just jump down to source 3, which is Bava Kama 60a, when permission is given. Well, what kind of permission is given? Here in 60a, we begin Tane Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef taught, and what is really stunning to me is that this is Rav Yosef. The Rav Yosef of Bava Kama 60a is the same Rav Yosef we just saw crying over Proverbs 13:23 in Masechet Chagiga. Tane Rav Yosef. What is the meaning of that which is written? This is our parsha this week. V'yatem lo teitzu ish mi petach beito ad boker. What is the meaning of Exodus 12:22? Nobody go out from your home until morning. Why? Why shouldn't someone go out? The Israelites have nothing to fear. God is out to get the Egyptians. Answer, Kevan shenitan reshut lemashchit. Once permission is given to the destroyer, once God unleashes the destroyer, eino mavchin bein sadikim l'rishaim. The destroyer just sees red. And does not distinguish between the righteous, those who do not deserve death, those whose time has not come, and the evildoers, those whose time has come. So in other words, the Israelites should stay in because once they step outside, who knows what will happen. Below Ode, he continues, okay, the destroyer will begin with the tzaddikim first. So again, jumping back to Moline, Moline is saying, first of all, Sanhedrin 29a, just a homely saying. B, Sanhedrin 29a is complicated by Chagiga. We see that mistakes do get made. People do die when they're not supposed to die. When people are exposed, when they're vulnerable, when something is out there that can do harm, that makes them extra vulnerable, it makes them prone to being caught up even when it is not their time. And then, as he points out, this is all the more true. And what's beautiful rhetorically about Moline's movement from source 2 to source 3 is that source 3, he climaxes this set of 3 sources with a source that actually deals with a plague. Because Exodus 12:22, we are actually dealing with God and the 10th plague unleashing this destroyer who is out to destroy the firstborn in all of Egypt. So the case is built, and he says what we see here, v'darshinan milo tetzu, as we expound from this verse, Exodus 22, once the permission is given to the destroyer, everybody is fair game. The destroyer is not necessarily going to make the distinctions one would perhaps hope that the destroyer makes. Everybody is fair game, and therefore everyone must stay inside. Umehai ta'ama, he says, from this reason, Moline summarizes to this point, rigilin livroach. They are accustomed, or we are accustomed to flee. In other words, the questioner has begun with the assumption that it's forbidden to flee. Moline basically points out that given the confusion, given what might happen, given the theological complication, the fact that anybody could suffer from this plague at any moment, in fact, it is permitted to flee. And he uses this phrase, and this is where, were we taking a more social historical direction, there would be more to say. He talks about rigilin livroach, the fact that people are accustomed to flee. And then here, I'm just going to do one more line and then turn it over to you briefly with another text with a question. I'll just point out here his interim summary. He says, Mikol Hani Moreh, from all of these, it shows, it teaches, it directs, De'ein tov la'amod bimkom sakana v'chule, that it's not good to stand, la'amod, to remain in a place of danger. And then he says, V'chein ra'iti gedolim, thus have I seen great ones, great people, shahalchu l'makom acher, who went to another place. So the plague comes, therefore one should go. Now there's another text, again, all of this is just so interesting, how these Talmudic texts, they contradict each other. Talmudic texts can contradict each other, we all know that. They certainly can contradict each other in glatt halachic matters. I would say all the more so can they contradict each other or be in tension with each other when we're talking about matters of emunot v'deot in theological matters. So the text that I'm going to turn over to you for your consideration, and then I guess we're going to have to think about, well, I'll worry about that in a minute, is Bava Kama, 60b. We took ourselves, I took you through the beginning here, Bava Kama 60a. On Bava Kama 60b, there was a lengthier discussion of plague that, shall we say, complicates Moline's interim conclusion that fleeing in a time of plague is something to do. So my question to you is, I'm going to turn it over to you for, I would say, let's take 15 minutes. I would say no more than 15 minutes to ponder Bava Kama 60b and answer or think about the question, how can Bava Kama 60b, first of all, I'm sort of laying the groundwork here that it complicates Moline's conclusion, but how can Bava Kama 60b be made consistent with the direction that Moline seems to want to go in, which is that it's permitted to flee a place of plague? So again, the question is, how can Bava Kama 60b be made consistent with Moline's direction that it should be permitted to flee a place of plague? All right, so we'll break it up. We'll see what happens. And again, I'm tough with this. So we'll be back in, I would say, a little under 15 minutes. So how does 60b, how can it be reconciled with Moline's tendency to permit people to flee a place of plague. Welcome back, everybody. Okay. So we have a little taste of Chavruta there. Okay, so again, our question was, seeing that Moline was trying to lead us away from the questioner's assumption that it's forbidden to flee a plague zone, trying to lead us in the direction of, yes, it is permitted to flee a plague zone. And I should point out, it's a little unfair for me to point this out, but I'm going to point it out anyway, because I'm just an unfair kind of person. If you look at the whole responsum, and again, I carved around it, but I didn't carve unfairly, but still, if you look at the whole responsum, Moline never says it's commanded to flee a plague zone. He never says that one is obligated to. He speaks in terms of it's permitted. And as we saw right before we broke into the rooms, rigilin, that it was customary, that he saw Gedolim do it. But it's interesting that, you know, it's permitted. He doesn't necessarily say it's commanded. And that's just something that I just want to continue to think about. Okay, so we had what Moline said, and my charge to you was looking at this, and again, the Breita beginning here, Dever Ba'ir, on Bava Kama 60b, the sages taught in a Breita, if there is Dever Ba'ir, Kanos Raglecha, gather your feet. A nice, colorful way of saying, don't go out. And there's a lot of back and forth. Oh, they start the drag racing earlier and earlier here now. Sorry, I can't mute myself. Don't go out, and there's some back and forth with the scriptural verses, which is interesting. We'll get to in a minute. So let me just open it up to you for a minute for some of the conversation that you may have had in Chavruta. How can one harmonize this with Moline's direction that maybe one should be permitted to flee a plague zone? I mean, I think this Breita seems pretty clear that it wants you to stay home. Why don't we use we could use the mechanical hand, the hand raising feature. That works well in class. That way Zoom tells me right away who's speaking. Oh, very good. So I see, is that you, David?
Yes.
Yes, David.
The conclusion that we were taking it to our time is that that even though the virus is still everywhere and there's a vaccine coming, that if you've remained COVID-free, you need to sort of stay COVID-free by staying away from other people with the virus. And that's just one of the takeaways we got from it. The other thing is that we commented on the fact that in this time, nobody understood how viral or bacterial transmission works. So we didn't know whether people could become contaminated by a virus or bacteria, whether they were in their home or outside of their home.
Right. And it's interesting. I mean, your first point, I think you actually, in your own words, are kind of creeping towards what is going to be Moline's perspective on Bava Kama 60b. But your second point, it's interesting, when I read in a few minutes quickly to the end of this Breita, they certainly don't know about viruses and all of that, but they do understand that people can be a danger to other people in this situation. That they certainly do understand. Okay, good. So again, David's first comment, I think, is beginning to move us along the path to understanding how Moline makes sense of this text, which otherwise doesn't necessarily appear to help him. Does somebody else want to weigh in?
Alyssa, so I have Melanie Aaron wrote in the chat, and she was my Havruta partner, showed people using their efficacy to avoid the angel of death, sort of giving people agency. We kind of read ahead a bit and looked at, because there were a lot of examples of if there's something going on in the road or in a synagogue or whatever to determine whether or not you should go there. So it really seems to give people agency in determining whether they stay or not in a particular situation. And it gives like very specific examples of when you stay and when you leave, as opposed to a blanket, you can leave.
Right. Even though it's good that you're pointing that out. On the other hand, though, again, there is a tendency in Bava Kama 60b. But yes, there isn't that sort of unequivocal do this, do that. I saw, I think, the hand, Rabbi Michelle.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So what we were discussing in our chavruta is really a challenge, because on the one hand, when the Maharal quotes Hagiga, he's saying that you shouldn't put yourself in a vulnerable situation. But in Baba Kama 60b, with the examples of if there's a plague, you should walk in the middle of the street, and you shouldn't go into the synagogue by yourself, that those are examples of how you should be with people, right? Because in the middle of the street, that's where most of the people are going to hang out. And in the synagogue, you can't go in alone, you have to go in with a minyan. And so there seems to be a contradiction here that we couldn't figure out how to resolve. That on the one hand, you shouldn't put yourself in danger, but on the other hand, if it's a plague, being with a lot of people is putting yourself in danger. So that's the challenge that I was hoping you would clear up.
Okay, good. Hopefully before we're done, we'll at least try to hack our way through that a little bit. Shifra?
Yeah, I was going to put this in theological terms and say, and David and I discussed this too, that if you don't say, well, God is watching over me, and so I wouldn't go before my time. Rather say, well, I should just stay out of the way of the angel of death and whatever I need to do that.
Okay, good, right. So with that as a good segue, let's go look at 60b. And again, in the back and forth of the scriptural verses, I mean, we see interesting things. That back and forth of the dialectic can be very revealing. So Tana Rabbanan, the sages taught, Dever ba'ir kanos raglecha, stay in, Shene'emar, and then we quote the verse again. V'atem, this was Exodus 12:22. V'atem lo teitzu ish mipetach beito ad boker. Ve'omer, and it says, scripture says, Lecha mi bo b'chadarecha usgor delatecha ba'adecha. This is Isaiah 26:20. Go, my people, go into your rooms and basically shut the door. Ve'omer, and it says, we get a third scriptural verse. This is back to the Torah, Deuteronomy 32:25. Michutz tishakel cherev. The sword is going to hack away and cause bereavement outside. Umechadarim ema, and in the rooms there is fear. Now, whenever you have three verses like this, the Gemara wonders why have three when you could have one? So clearly the Gemara's assumption is each has to have a role. Each one must teach something. Each successive verse must teach something that I wouldn't have known had it not been there. So my va'omer, what is the first va'omer? Why do I need the Isaiah verse? V'chitema hani mile balelia, if you should say, I should only stay home at night during a plague. That's what Exodus 12:22 says. It says, don't go out until morning. So if you should say, okay, I'll stay home at night, aval b'yamama lo, but during the day, no. During the day, I'm not going to stay home. I'm going to go out. Tashma, come and hear the Isaiah verse. The Isaiah verse says, come, my people, enter your chambers and shut the doors. In other words, it doesn't matter if it's day or night. If it's during a plague, stay home. Okay, so I have those two verses. Then why do I need the third verse, Deuteronomy? And if you say, Hane mile deleka ema begavai, migavai, maybe you say, okay, it's a great idea for me to stay home during a plague if there's no danger in the house. If there's no danger in the house and it's safe in the house, then maybe fine, day and night I'll stay in the house. But in a situation in which there is danger, ema, fear, terror, there is terror inside. Maybe if in a time of plague there's danger and terror in the house, maybe it's better for me to go out to be with people, but savta. Maybe there is safety in numbers. Maybe I should be with people. No, tashma, that's what the third verse from Deuteronomy comes to tell me. Don't think that. Afal gav de ma, says the Gemara, even though the fear is within, michutz tishak el cherev, the sword is causing bereavement outside. In other words, the Gemara uses these 3 verses to basically shut down any possibility of your leaving your house at a time of plague. I might think I could go out during the day. No, that's what Isaiah tells me I can't do. I might think I could go out if there's danger in the house. Maybe it's better out of the house. No, that's what Deuteronomy tells me. And then we get some nice advice. I mean, you have to love the Babylonian rabbis. I mean, they're so us in so many ways. Rava be'idan ritcha havasachar kave. What did Rava do at a time of plague? He would close the windows. Good. I mean, that's, nice, sound rabbinic advice. Dichtiv, as it says. Why? Because death can come through our windows. That's Jeremiah 9:20. Tanu Rabbanan, Dever Ba'ir, if there is plague in the city, Al Yahalech Adam Be'emtza Haderech, don't walk in the middle of the street. Why? Because I live by Queens Boulevard and I'll get run over. No, because Malach Hamavet Mahalech Be'emtza Hadrachim, same difference, I guess. The angel of death goes in the middle of the road. Now, Dekevan Diahiva Le Rishuta. Here is a key theological term that we'll see when we get back to the Maharil. Once he is given permission, Dekevan Diahiva Le Rishuta, once he, the angel of death, is given permission, Maske Lahedya, to walk openly. Once the angel of death is given permission to walk openly, basically all bets are off. Anybody could be in danger. So again, you get this text, which is very, very clear on the fact that, sorry for causing motion sickness. I cause myself motion sickness, but that's how it goes. You get this text, which seems very clearly to conflict with what the Maharil wants to do, what Moline wants, which is to open up a permission to flee a place of plague. And then he explains it. So we've heard some of your ideas. You've all correctly pointed to fissures and tensions in these various texts. Let's see what he does with it. We're back in the responsum. V'hod amrinan perikakones, and that which we say in the chapter, the one who brings in, this is chapter 6 of Bava Kama, kanos raglecha, the beginning of our Braita, v'yalif mikra'e tuva, says the Maharil, and it learns from many verses. V'yalif mikra'e tuva, it learns from many verses. The Maharil says, shamati mipi mori harav shalom sheyichye. I heard from the mouth of my teacher, Rav Shalom. This is Rabbi Shalom of Neustadt in Germany, the teacher of the Maharil, and he says, Sheyichye. In other words, he's alive. May he live. May he have a long life. How did Rabbi Shalom of Neustadt teach the Maharil to understand Bava Kama 60b? De la'achar shehitchil v'nitchazek. After the plague has begun and has strengthened, after it has hitchil v'nitchazek, it has begun and it has strengthened. So you've gone from some people catching a virus to an epidemic or a pandemic status. V'it yahiv le reshuta lamaske lahedya. Here, Rabbi Shalom was quoting right from the end of that text in Bava Kama. V'it yahev le reshuta, and permission is given to him, to the angel of death, lamaske lahedya, to walk openly. In other words, the angel of death now has free reign. Yesh lichnos raglav. One must. Yesh lichnos is more directive. One must literally gather up his legs. One must stay home. But when? It is after the plague has begun and has strengthened. In other words, presumably, according to Shalom of Neustadt, there is a period of time in which the plague may be coming, but it has not yet really gathered force, taken strength, strengthened. There's a period of time in which one could flee. the Amrina Nami, and here he quotes another source from Yerushalmi, tractate Brachot that I didn't bring you, the Amrina Nami. We also say Kol Hadrachim B'chezkat Sakana. All of the roads are legally presumed to be places of danger. And again, this is a line from Yerushalmi Brachot, the context of which was not relevant to us. Aval mitchila, but from the beginning. In other words, there's this early point in the emergence of the plague when tov hu livroach, when it's good to flee. So in other words, Shalom of Neustadt conveys to the Maharil, who conveys to us an understanding of how Bava Kama 60b can be harmonized with the view that one can flee a plague zone. Bava Kama 60b is talking about a later stage of the plague. After the plague has taken hold, when it's ravaging the population, when there is a very high danger of contagion and death, at that point, one can no longer flee. But there is an earlier point at which one may flee. Then he brings in our last set of texts, which is interesting, Uva Masechta Ta'anit. In Tractate Ta'anit, the tractate that deals, generally speaking, with fast days. I'll just note here for the moment that it's source number 5, and then I will jump down right away to Tractate Ta'anit, and he tells us, Moline, why he brings Tractate Ta'anit. Here on page 21b, Chaf Aleph Amud Bet of Ta'anit, we get a series of ma'asim, a series of little stories about things that occurred, news of plague that erupted, and how rabbis responded. Amaru le Rav Yehuda, they said to Rav Yehuda, Ika motana b'chazire. There's swine flu, literally. There is a death incident among the pigs. Gazar ta'anita. He decreed a fast among the people. What's interesting is why, I'm going to jump over some of the dialectic, Sha'ane chazire de damyan me'ayhu levnei inshe. Why? Because pig innards resemble human innards. I am not a zoologist. I am not a veterinarian. I don't work on a farm. I'm just reporting the news here. Sha'ane chazire de damyan me'ayhu levnei inshe. So the fear being presumably that the swine flu would then jump to people. Amaru le Shmuel, Ika motana bechozai. This is another incident. They said to the Amora Shmuel, there's a plague in Bechozai. Gazar ta'anita, he decreed a fast. Amar le v'hamarchak, it's far away from Babylonia. Why are you decreeing a fast? Amar leka ma'abra hacha de pasikle. Shmuel was very practical. He said, there's nothing stopping it from coming here. There is no crossing. There's nothing stopping it from coming to Bavel. The plague may be far away in Bechozai, but we're going to fast because it may come to us. Another occasion, Amaru Leila Rav Nachman, they said to Rav Nachman, an Amora of Babylonia, Ika motana ba'ara di Israel. There is a plague in the land of Israel. Gazar ta'anita. Then they go on basically, okay, I understand because Eretz Yisrael is the Gevira, the great lady, as opposed to Bavel, which is the Shifcha, the maidservant. The point being ultimately that really the plague could come from anywhere. I'm cutting right through it. Sha'ane hatam kevan de'ika shar, and this is where I go back to a point David made before. Kevan de'ika shayata delavai va'atya bahadeh. You can have, in fact, the pestilence joining a caravan. The caravans are there. The pestilence literally delavai. It will accompany them. Va'atya bahadeh, and will come with them. So again, they don't know about virology. They don't know about contagion, but they, understand enough on a practical level to know that the contagion can carry with them. So then we have this source from Ta'anit, which basically makes the point that one must always be concerned about pestilence. Even if it is far away, it could come. it could come. You have rabbis decreeing fasts in order to pray and entreat divine mercy that these plagues not come. So what does that do for Molin? Molin makes the point about the text from Ta'anit, V'chol zeh moreh, all of this teaches, ahod amrinan eino mavchin v'chulei. What he says is these texts from Ta'anit, these stories about how rabbis decreed fasts, even though the plague might involve animals and not humans, or the plague might be far away. He said all of this goes to buttress the point made by the Sugya in Chagigah, which is that there's no distinction, that once plague gets unleashed, there's no distinguishing who, quote unquote, has the time to die, who doesn't, or as per Bava Kama 60a, once the mashchit is being given permission, there is no distinguishing who the mashchit is going to destroy and who the mashchit is not going to destroy. So again, Molin uses the text from Ta'anit to support his overall point that al kain nireh, therefore it appears the ein kan shum isur, that there is here no prohibition. There is no prohibition against fleeing a place of plague. And again, the troubling text, Bava Kama 60b, which seems to be very unequivocal about staying at home, he relies on his own teacher to say, well, that applies at a particularly late stage of the plague. So against his questioner, who was inclined to say that there is no permission to flee the plague, Molin is saying there is permission to flee the plague. And again, going back to the core hermeneutical issue that fascinates me is the interplay of these intertwined and not consistent, rather inconsistent Talmudic sources about this issue. Ultimately, his point is one cannot rely on any sort of sense of, well, of course, God acts in a certain understandable way in the world that we can recognize as just, that those who die, it may be sad, it may be tragic, it may be devastating, but God in God's infinite wisdom had decreed that thus it should be, and thus it is. No. The Talmud doesn't think that way, and Molin doesn't think that way. Molin, again, marshaling these other Talmudic sources, making the point one cannot rely on that. The Talmudic rabbis, we in the 14th and 15th century, we understand that bad things happen, that forces get unleashed in the world, that we cannot always understand why some people get cut down, but what we would say before their time, that people are destroyed and devastated when we don't expect them. And we cannot necessarily stay put for whatever reason we think it is appropriate or right to stay put, when in fact we can't rely on our own righteousness or our own sense that it's not going to be us. If it's an early stage of the plague, if the plague has not caught on, if it's not devastating the populace, as Shalom of Neustadt, it has not yet nitchazek, it hasn't yet strengthened, one can still flee. At a later stage of the plague, well then yes, one perhaps at that point should follow the advice of Bava Kama 60b and stay put. The last source I wanted to look at is a little line from Shlomo Luria. I always say I'm not in any hurry, apropos of our topic this afternoon. I'm certainly in no hurry to get to the next world. But when I get there, Luria, Shlomo Luria, this is not the Kabbalist Isaac Luria, this is Shlomo Luria, is one of the people I'd like to meet. Luria quotes at length from this responsum of the Maharil in his commentary to Bava Kama 60b. I only pulled out something which is particularly interesting, and I underlined it. He brings the money quote from Shalom of Neustadt, that one stays home. Hainu achar shehitchil hadever v'nitchazek, that Bava Kama's advice to stay home is after the plague has begun and has really strengthened. Ve'it yahevle reshuta lahaloch behedya, and after the plague has strengthened and the angel of death has been given permission from above to sort of run riot. Yesh lichnos, one should stay home. V'amrina nami, and then Luria quotes from Yerushalmi Brachot that in that situation, once the plague has strengthened, kol hadrachim b'chezkat sakana, that all roads are in a state of being dangerous. But then here's a little historical thing I just couldn't resist bringing to you. He says, "Im kain ein tov livroach." In other words, once the plague really is running rampant and there's danger everywhere, it's not good to flee. Befrat achar shenitchazek hadever, especially after the plague has strengthened. Yesh sakana levorchim bein ha'umot yoter min hadever. He says, once the plague has strengthened, there's more danger for the fleeing. And by the fleeing here, he means the Jews. Fleeing Jews among the nations more than the plague. Ka'asher ba'avonotenu harabim yadua, as in our many sins is known. Why? Because people will blame the Jews for the plague. So Luria, in his situation in the 16th century, adds this rather melancholy particularist Jewish note. That once the plague has really taken hold and has strengthened, don't flee, because what's going to happen is the non-Jews are going to blame the Jews for spreading the plague. So again, sort of varying from my program, which was not social historical, I just wanted to bring that little melancholy note to you. Okay, we have a few minutes, so I have seen the chat filling up, but I have had to sort of let it go. But if anybody who's in the chat or anything else, I know you have a full schedule and a peaceful transition of power to effect in a few moments. But if anybody has any last questions, comments, anybody want to highlight what's in, you could be talking to each other in the chat, which is certainly fine.
Why doesn't the Maharal say that it's actually obligated for us to flee, given pikuach nefesh?
Let me just correct, it's not the Maharal, it's the Maharil. They're right, they're two different people. So I'm sorry, your question is, why is he not saying
why doesn't he say
right.
that you should flee because of pikuach nefesh?
I can't answer it. I mean, it's a question that I have. I can't answer it. My sneaking suspicion is that even though it's not until the 16th century that Shlomo Luria raises the issue of anti-Jewish backlash, I'm sure because in the Black Death, with which the Maharil was familiar, of course, Jews were murdered and mobbed on accusations of poisoning the well. So it's not unthinkable that that was percolating in his mind too, but he doesn't treat it in the responsum.
I have a question, and unfortunately, this will
Yes.
have to be the last one. Is he saying you should flee because, you can save yourself, and that you shouldn't flee later on because it's not going to be safe? Or is this a moral position about fleeing or not fleeing?
I think it's the first. No, I think it's the first. I think it's a matter of saving yourself, and then later you're not going to be saving yourself. There is going to be danger in the roads. Things are out of control. You could be in danger. Other people could be in danger. So it really is a matter of the religious, preserving your own life and what is the more appropriate way to go about it at which stage.
Okay, Howard, last question. Howard Leibson has a question.
Yes.
I assumed they didn't know that by fleeing, they could be carrying the pestilence with them. And that's why there's no discussion of the fear of spreading the
Well,
illness.
I think they were aware that people could be a danger to other people. Again, clearly they didn't have our understanding of microbiology and all that, but I think they are aware of it. And again, that goes back to Bava Kama 60b, Ta'anit 21b, where where a plague is said to accompany a caravan. They do understand that people can be a danger to other people, or that even animals could potentially be a danger to people. So there is that, they do have that understanding, even though, of course, they don't know how it works.
Well, I want to thank you for a very stimulating discussion and series of texts that really are terribly relevant to where we are today during
Yeah,
COVID.
terribly, yes, terribly.
Yes,
relevant.
terribly. Thank you so much.
Thank you again for the invitation, and nice to see you all. Nice to see people I haven't seen in a while. Special shout out to you, Larry. Nice to see you again, and be well.
You're welcome to watch the peaceful transition, transfer of power if you'd like, or you may leave.
Thank you. I think I'll peacefully transit
Peacefully leave. Okay, thank you.
out. Bye-bye.
Okay, so we are going to peacefully transition to the installation of our board and our officers. And I would like to call on Lisa Hochberg Miller, who is going to give us our invocation.
Great, wonderful. Hi, thank you. It's nice to be with everybody. What a wonderful afternoon to study together. Thank you, Suzanne, for arranging Dr. Gray. That was wonderful. Well, it's nice to be with everybody, and we'll just take a moment to transition from getting the opportunity to study together and such an incredible topic and relevance to celebrating our being together. So I'd like to offer this invocation for us as we start today. Wherever we are seated at this moment, let us lift ourselves to a different place, a place of palm trees and hot springs, blue skies and vivid mountains, pink in the setting sun, a place of hotels, air conditioning, and executive suites. That line's for you, Larry.
Thank you.
Palm Canyon A and plaza rooms A, B, C, and D. For it is there that community emerges each year, like Brigadoon, birthed each January for the briefest of moments, and renewed with friendships, laughter, the spark of Torah and insight. Yet the community exists not in that place, but in this place, the souls of rabbis, who sustain and are sustained, who nurture and are nurtured, daily, weekly, monthly, annually. The magic of PARR, a dwelling place for the rabbinic soul of this region. We know God's presence is with us because it is ever so, and vividly so, when colleague is with colleague. We continue the tradition of PARR by celebrating leadership, mentorship, scholarship among those who answer the call to rise. May we feel blessed, humbled, supported, and elevated by the work that we do together year after year. And colleagues, will you join me in an amen? Amen.
Amen. Oh, that was beautiful, Lisa. Did you write that? Obviously, you had to have.
No, I lifted it off the internet.
Oh, yeah, right. It's beautiful.
I think
Thank
Hilton
you.
Palm Springs has that.
I borrowed it from that beautiful young lady yesterday.
Aw, thank you so much. That was beautiful.
Lisa,
And,
you always have been a good writer.
I'm going to toss it to Larry, our PARR czar.
As many of you know, the wife of our almost past president, current president, Evan Goodman, the wife of Evan Goodman, Lori, was a contestant on Jeopardy several months ago, and she was a winner. And she got a substantial prize from now the late Alex Trebek. But one thing that Alex couldn't do that we are able to do is to offer to Evan something unique, and that is the past president's plaque from PARR. As we said at the beginning this afternoon, Evan has not only served a year, but a little over a year. And I want to be quite candid with you. I think that if I'm not mistaken, Evan is the 35th president that I have worked with during my years as the executive vice president. And some of the past presidents I know are, if you will, in the room right now. But Evan, I've got to tell you, you have worked beyond what anyone expected of you. And we thank you so very much. And when we get to see each other, hopefully in Palm Springs or sometime before, I've got it right there, I will give you this plaque, which is simply says PARR expresses its gratitude to Evan Goodman for outstanding leadership as president in the year 2020. And there's some Hebrew underneath it, so I'll leave it to others to translate, but I think it starts off with Yevarechecha and so on. Evan, give us your parting words.
Wow, thank you, Larry. I knew you'd work Jeopardy in there somehow. I wasn't sure exactly how, but thank you. When I was looking down the ladder and I was thinking that 6 years ago I began this journey, I never, ever would have imagined this year would have been the way it was. And yet, it is the year just passed and we've done good things with it. For me, every single year since my ordination and return to California, since January of 1994, without interruption, the first week in January has meant one thing to me, reconnecting with colleagues, with you, Larry, with so many of the people around this virtual screen right now, and with friends in Palm Springs. And at the beginning of this month, I really felt the lack and the absence of our annual gathering very deeply. And I was especially noting, along with a bunch of people on here, how Facebook memories were popping up of pictures of all the different celebrations we've had over the years. This last year, we really reinvented PARR on the fly. At first, we thought it was going to be short term, and then when we realized this was not going to pass quickly, we did good things. And I want to give very special thank you to my vice president and soon to be president, Suzanne Singer, for working so diligently to turn the conference that Suzanne is a real planner. And has planned things well ahead. And when it came time to replanning this to turn her real convention into a virtual convention, you did an amazing job. So thank you, Suzanne, for giving us reason to come to PARR in these months. And for the rest of the executive committee for being wise counsel amongst myself, Suzanne, Harry, Heidi, Lisa, Rick and Cheryl, along with Larry. All of you have helped us to make PARR relevant in a year when it would have been really easy for us to just kick the can down the road 1 year. It's been an honor serving in this position. When I took this on, I particularly set out to want to make my convention and some of the initiatives during my year of leadership to highlight the role of non-congregational rabbis within the movement. And I feel that last year's conference, we succeeded in opening some eyes and bringing in some new faces into our organization. I hope that the board can continue those down that path and continue to go from strength to strength. And I truly mean it with all my heart, next year in Palm Springs.
Thank you, Evan. I am given the task now, although it's been made a little easier for me this year, to discharge the members of the executive board of the year 2020 and to install the members of the board, the executive board of the year 2021. Guess what? They're the same. The officers and board determined, because of the circumstances, the members of the executive board would stay on for another year. And they are the following. Again, they're being discharged and they're being installed, same people. And they are Alexis Burke, Daniel Brenner, Max Chaikin, Johanna Hershenson, Alana Mills, Miriam Phillips, Eric Rosenstein, Jason Rosner, Daniel Scher, Wendy Spears, Brian Zive, and Zach Zeisman. You will receive in the mail your individual assignments, maybe, but in any case, we happily install you as members of the executive board for 2021. It's my pleasure now to discharge the officers of PARR for the year 2020. I will list their names and the function that they fulfilled so wonderfully during this past year. Immediate past president, Cheryl Rosenstein. Corresponding secretary, Rick Steinberg. Treasurer, Lisa Hochberg Miller. Recording secretary, Heidi Cohen. Second vice president, Harry Rosenfeld. First vice president, Suzanne Singer. And you've heard already, President Evan Goodman. You are now formally discharged from your roles. The officers for the year 2021, with one exception, are the following. Immediate past president, Evan Goodman. Corresponding secretary, Danny Weiner. Treasurer, Rick Steinberg. Recording secretary, Lisa Hochberg Miller. Second vice president, Heidi Cohen. First vice president, Harry Rosenfeld. With a power vested in me, it's my pleasure to install you in the position that you have been elected to, which leaves us with the incoming president of PARR. And our incoming president has chosen two people to install her as president. These two gentlemen are both named Steve, so it makes it easy for me. Both Steve Chester and Steve Einstein. And when we get the opportunity, communicate with them, because each of them deserves a hearty mazal tov, not only for installing Suzanne, but they are each celebrating 50 years in the rabbinate. We congratulate them. And I know, Suzanne, you've chosen them because they have been, are, and will continue to be role models for you and for all of us in the rabbinate. And Steve, mazal tov, I love you both. And I'll let you continue. You guys decide, but let's have our first speaker, Steve.
I am the first Steve. And the way we decided this is because we both go back a ways with Suzanne, but I go back, I think, a little further. And so I get the first nod. I have enjoyed for many years my role as a mentor to rabbinical students. Usually that was done under the auspices of HUC, but on one occasion, I was what is called a CCAR mentor. Many of you know the CCAR set up a mentorship program whereby a seasoned rabbi, meaning an old rabbi, would work with a newer rabbi, an emerging rabbi, during that person's final year at HUC, and then kind of provide guidance or assistance during the first 2 years out in the field. And I had the privilege of being assigned Suzanne Singer. Now, I will tell you, I entered HUC 1 week before I graduated from high school. They used to grab us when we were very young. Many of our colleagues here probably entered HUC right after college or maybe a year after. That was often the style, shall we say. With Suzanne, it was a very different situation. Here I was called upon to mentor somebody who, while she is many years younger than I am, well, some years younger, she had a lot of life experience, and in many ways, more than I. Some people may not know that Suzanne had a career, and I don't mean a short-term career, a career of a couple of decades working in public television. As a matter of fact, I can say without fear of contradiction, she will today become the first PARR president who had ever won, not one, but I understand 2 Emmys before entering HUC. And unlike when Larry talks and we're not sure if he's joking around half the time, I'm actually very serious. Many of you are familiar with the PBS program POV, and you're looking at Susanna, a person who had a great deal to do with that. Anyway, she didn't rest on her laurels or her fame, though, when she became a rabbi. I would say that Suzanne and I are different in our approaches, perhaps, to, let's say, ritual matters and so on. I'm a little more on the traditional side. She is more on the progressive side, you might say, in those terms. One thing that we share very much in common, and we're going to have an argument after I'm done talking as to which of us inspires the other, and that is in the area of social action. And I will state that I am continually inspired by her work on the ground, as well as in the more theoretical area. And she's an active member of our Movements Commission on Social Action, but she's out there on the streets also. She is not afraid of speaking out prophetically. And she's in Riverside, California, not known to be a very liberal environment. But she says it as it is, and let the chips fall where they may. And so I will say one last thing about Suzanne, and that is our relationship continues. And it has blossomed into not simply a mentor-mentee, but colleague and friend. But I very much appreciate the fact that Suzanne does call frequently to talk about what's going on in the world, and any thoughts I might have and how we can strengthen one another in our work. So it's a joy to be with my dear friend and classmate going back all those years, Steve Chester, in sharing this moment of joy with Suzanne. I'll turn it over now to Steve Chester, and let's hear what he has to say.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you, Suzanne, for asking me to do this also. I too, Steve, just for your information, was accepted in high school at HUC. So I guess at the time, the Los Angeles campus needed a lot of students and accepted us very, very early. Lou could speak to that, perhaps, as I see his face there. I remember our interview, and wherever we interviewed, I can't remember, Suzanne. And one of the questions became, well, we're going to be taking someone with so much experience. Do we want someone who has not had any rabbinic experience and yet is older? And it was our congregation that said definitely, and it's always was a blessing to have you. We worked together at Sinai in Oakland, and of course today is also Oakland Day because of Vice President Harris. If you looked at the Oakland paper this morning, the biggest picture was the swearing in of the vice president on the Oakland paper, and the little president, a picture of the president being sworn in because of her being from here, from Oakland. And it was an honor for me always to share the Bima with you and to share the congregation with you as we did rabbiing together. And one thing I learned about you, and it continues, was you're a person of passion and you're a person of compassion. Passion, of course, for social justice and for social justice issues. Sinai was always known as a congregation very interested in social justice and social action, and you brought us to the next level. I really have to say that. And people still talk about you today and what you did, and especially that one program of bringing community together at Sinai. The other is you have traveled, of course, as Steve alluded to, throughout the world, helping people, caring for the poor, caring for the needy on an individual level, and watching you and hearing you and reading you in Truah, also on a level that goes beyond the individual. Your voice sounds loudly for our movement and for humanity, and I can think of nothing better for a rabbi to be and to do. A rabbi of compassion also within our congregational life. You care for individuals within the congregation. You're highly respected and still spoken of in very, very positive terms about a rabbi who came to the hospital and visited all the time, a rabbi who cared for people who were in need. And it was a loss to our congregation and to me as your partner on the Bima that you left to be with family in Los Angeles and were greatly missed for a very long time. But Suzanne, I don't want you to get too swell-headed, because I do have to tell this story about you also that makes you very human. I don't know if you remember or not, but we were going to a meeting and you were following me in your car and you said, "Steve, is it okay if I follow you?" And I said, "Of course." So we drove and you were following me and I stopped at a stop sign and you rear-ended me. And at that point, a congregant ran out of his house. We weren't even at the meeting house, but it so happened in front of a congregant's house. And he ran out and asked if everyone were okay. And we said yes, and the cars were okay. And we went on. And believe it or not, because I respected you so much, I didn't even bring it up to a vote for the board to dismiss you because you weren't driving so well. But on a serious note, you, Suzanne, were wonderful to work with, wonderful to be with, and a wonderful dogma, a wonderful dogma for our congregation and its idea of social justice and passion and compassion. So I read the following. Our God and God of our ancestors, bestow your blessings upon Suzanne. Instill in her wisdom and righteousness, steadfastness and devotion as she assumes the position now of the president of PARR. Continue to grant her a wise heart, candor, and courage, and may she respond to every challenge with dignity, implant within her a full measure of your compassion, that she might embody the words of our tradition. Yivarech Adonai v'yishmerech, may God bless you and keep you. Ya'er Adonai panav elayich v'chunaych, may God's light shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yisa Adonai panav elayich v'yasem lach shalom. Suzanne, may you always feel God's presence and continue to spread the word of God that all human beings are created b'tselem Elohim, and all have a right to justice and care, to health, and to all that all of us deserve, no matter who we are or where we live. And may you find and help bring to the world inner peace for yourself and peace to this world. And let's all say together, Amen.
Amen.
Mazal Tov.
Wow, thank you so much, both of you. I don't really know who you're talking about, but it sounded really beautiful. And Mazal Tov to both of you for your 50 years of service. And you definitely have both been amazing inspirations to me. I've been very fortunate to have both of you in my life and to continue to be able to call you friends and colleagues. It's of course a real honor to be installed as the president of PARR. And it is especially meaningful to have the two of you, my valued mentors, officiating. As all of you know, this week's Torah portion is Bo, which includes the plague of darkness. We read that the Egyptians were enveloped in a darkness where a person could not see their friend and no one could get up from where they were. Rabbi Harold Kushner writes in his commentary, perhaps the Egyptians were depressed by the series of calamities that had struck them. I think this is where many of us have found ourselves over the past few years. There's so much to feel overwhelmed by and helpless about. The out of control pandemic, the plight of millions of Americans who have sunk into poverty, the caustic political situation, the rise in hate crimes and anti-Semitism, the killing of Black men and women by the police, even a fourth election in 2 years in Israel. On top of that, we have been made increasingly aware of the role of systemic racism and what it has played in our lives. Rabbi Kushner goes on to speculate that the Egyptians might have been depressed by the realization of how much their own comfort depended on the enslavement of others. As American Jews, we have come to realize that we have played a role in perpetuating the system of racial injustice, whether consciously or not. So, yes, there have been plenty to make us feel as though we were surrounded by an immobilizing darkness. But yesterday was a great day. It revived hope for me and for so many others. And as one of the people that I admire greatly, Ruth Messenger, she said, "We do not have the luxury of being overwhelmed." So where do we go from here? Kushner offers us this story from the Talmud in Brachot, a Talmudic debate on when to know that it is dawn. Now, is it when we can distinguish between blue and white? Is it when we can distinguish between a wolf and a dog, a domesticated donkey and a wild one? No, the Talmud concludes that it is when we can recognize the face of a friend. Kushner expands this to say that dawn arrives when we can recognize any human as a friend. And I think that this is our path forward. Let us begin right here at PARR. When we look around at the various squares in our Zoom screen, we see the faces of friends. As Lisa so beautifully spoke about in her poem and her prayer, the friendships that we have made and preserved through our membership in PARR, as well as our yearly conventions, sustain us through the many struggles we have faced and continue to face. They've helped us to pursue our struggle for social justice. They've encouraged us when we have felt isolated and frustrated. They've allowed us to share not only our sorrows, but our profound joys and successes. I don't think there's another region in this country that has such a flourishing partnership. Thanks are due to everyone here, and especially to our former and outgoing presidents, officers, and boards. And of course, a very special thanks is due to our own PARR czar, Larry Goldmark. I'd like to close my remarks with the ending of the poem, "The Hill We Climb," by Amanda Gorman, a voice we heard yesterday during the inauguration. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left with. Every breath from her bronze-powdered chest. We will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the gold-limbed hills of the West. We will rise from the windswept Northeast, where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked South. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover. And every known nook of our nation and every corner called our country, our people diverse and beautiful will emerge, battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light. If only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. So thank you all so much for giving me this honor. And we're going to close this installation with some beautiful music by our new officer, Danny Weiner.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It really is an honor. Mazal tov to all of my colleagues here, all of our colleagues. And it's a bit daunting to offer a melody for a president whose surname is Singer, but I will persevere nonetheless. Thought I would share an oldie but a goodie. Yair Bloom was IDF composer, but he also was a composer of many anti-war songs. I think that says something about the IDF and Tohar Neshek and that whole context. And I think in light of the the wonderful, peaceful transition of power we had here at PARR, and the not so peaceful transition of power we had in our country, and the promise of what perhaps lies ahead, we hope and pray. This is a bit of a wish for that. את המנגינה הזו אי אפשר להפסיק. את המנגינה הזאת אפשר להפסיק. מוכרחים להמשיך לנגן, מוכרחים להמשיך לנגן. מפני שאת המנגינה הזאת אי אפשר להפסיק. Sing it in your little Zoom cells there. את המנגינה הזאת אי אפשר להפסיק. את המנגינה הזאת אי אפשר להפסיק. מוכרחים להמשיך לנגן, מוכרחים להמשיך לנגן. מפני שאת המנגינה הזאת אי אפשר להפסיק. יישר כוח, everybody.
Thank you so much. That was perfect. And I just wanted to mention that our next PARR on Zoom will be on February 23rd. And we look forward to seeing all of you and more there. And thank you everyone for your very kind words. Any final words, Larry?
While Larry's unmuting himself, I'm going to just say, let's give a round of applause to Larry. Larry, you've been so helpful to me this year. When you nudge me, when you thank me, all the rest. And if people here knew how much you care about this behind the scenes, they would double your salary.
Thank you. And the only thing I have to say is amen.
Amen. Goodbye, everyone.
Mazel tov.